The gold foil wedding menu felt too stiff between my fingers, but the heavy paper weight was not what made the breath stop in my throat. I ran my thumb over the raised letters of the second course, tracing the unfamiliar ink. The ballroom around me hummed with the sound of 150 elite guests clinking crystal champagne flutes, and the warm air smelled heavily of roasted garlic, fresh rosemary, and browned butter. It was a fragrance I had spent my entire adult life breathing in. My late wife Eleanor and I created that exact recipe together. The two of us spent months perfecting the balance of spices before she passed away 6 years ago. Yet printed right there in elegant black calligraphy, her famous Sunday chicken had been renamed. The description beneath the dish read that it was a cherished childhood recipe from the bride, celebrating Camille Ashford and her affluent family heritage. I stared at the thick cardstock until the letters blurred. At 68 years old, I had built Mercer Table Catering from a single rusty delivery van into this city's most exclusive hospitality group, knowing every single dish that left my kitchens. Camille was 38, a woman who grew up eating catered meals in country clubs, and this bride had never cooked a piece of poultry in her life. My son's new wife had not just stolen a recipe, but she had erased the woman who invented it. I set the menu back down on the silk tablecloth and looked for my name card. The bride's parents had their names elegantly displayed at the center of the head table, and the groomsmen were seated to the left. But the small silver holder, where the father of the groom should have been sitting, was completely empty. Soft footsteps approached from behind, followed by a heavy scent of jasmine perfume. I turned around and saw my daughter-in-law standing in her custom designer gown. "Henry," Camille said, her voice dropping to that hushed, careful tone people usually save for hospitals or funerals. A manicured hand rested on my shoulder, but there was no warmth in the grip. "I am so glad you found a moment to look at the tables. Everything is absolutely perfect." I pointed at the empty space next to her father's seat. "My name card seems to have been misplaced." Camille offered a practiced, sympathetic smile. It was the exact expression this woman used in her social media videos when apologizing to her followers. "Oh, it is not misplaced at all. Michael and I talked about it, and we just thought you would be so much more comfortable in the back." "The back," I repeated. "With the catering team," she clarified, leaning in closer so the wealthy guests at the next table would not hear. "You know all of them, and you always say how much you prefer the kitchen to fancy parties. We did not want you to feel out of place among my family's business partners, especially since you are just a retired caterer." Just a retired caterer. I had stepped away from the daily operations 2 years ago, but Henry Mercer still retained full ownership and administrator authority over company systems. The people in the kitchen were my employees, serving food paid for by my company. And my son's new wife was banishing me to the staff break room, so her elite friends would not know she married into a working-class family. I looked past Camille and saw my son standing near the ice sculpture. Michael was 41 years old, dressed in a tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car, but he refused to meet my eyes. The groom stared firmly at his leather shoes, knowing exactly what his bride was doing. "Michael," I called out, keeping my voice steady. My son flinched, then slowly walked over to join us. He offered a tight, nervous laugh and adjusted his silk tie. "Dad, please. It is just a seating arrangement. Do not make a scene. Your mother's chicken is on this menu under Camille's name," I said, "and my seat is in the kitchen." "It is just a marketing story for Camille's new brand launch," Michael muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "People do it all the time, and it makes the event feel more authentic to her followers. Just let it go for tonight, okay? Let us have a perfect wedding." My own child was asking me to sit in silence while his wife stole his dead mother's legacy to sell to her rich friends. A cold knot tightened in my chest, replacing the grief with something sharp and focused. For 6 years, I had tried to protect Michael from the pain of losing Eleanor, handing him the prestige of the Mercer name. Now, this man was trading that name for a seat at a table that did not even want him. Camille patted my arm again. "The kitchen staff already set up a lovely little table near the dish pit for you, Henry. You can eat before the real dinner starts." I did not yell, nor did I flip the table or tear the stolen menu in half. I simply looked at the woman who thought she had just outsmarted me, and then my gaze shifted to the son who had sold his mother's memory for a wedding aesthetic. "You are right," I said quietly, picking up the gold foil menu and sliding it into my breast pocket. "I have always belonged in the kitchen." I turned my back on the glittering ballroom and walked toward the swinging metal doors of the prep area. They thought they were hiding an embarrassing old man, never realizing they had just sent the owner of the company directly to the people who actually controlled their perfect wedding. The heavy metal doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the string quartet and replacing it with the roar of a commercial kitchen in full service. Steam billowed from the industrial dishwashers, carrying the sharp scent of commercial sanitizer and roasted garlic. Stainless steel prep tables stretched across the center of the room, crowded with a dozen line cooks plating salads with practiced speed. It was a beautiful chaos, and for the first time all evening, my shoulders dropped. Rosa spotted me first. The 50-year-old floor manager stood near the plating station, holding a stack of payroll clipboards against her chest. We had hired her nearly 2 decades ago, back when my late wife still worked the line. A wide smile broke across her face, but it faded into a confused frown as she noticed my empty hands and the lack of a tuxedo jacket. "Mr. Mercer," Rosa said, stepping around a busboy carrying a tower of dirty plates. "Are you looking for Michael?" I pulled a heavy metal stool from under the prep counter and sat down near the dish pit. No, I was told my seat was back here. Her dark eyes widened, glancing toward the swinging doors, and then back at me. Back here. They put the owner of the company in the kitchen during his own son's wedding. "It appears I do not fit the marketing aesthetic," I said quietly, watching a young prep cook frantically wipe a smudge of dressing off a porcelain rim. Rosa sighed, pulling a clean linen napkin from an apron pocket and wiping down the steel counter in front of me. That small gesture carried more respect than anything my daughter-in-law had offered me all night. But there was a tightness in Rosa's jaw, a tension that had not been there 2 years ago when I stepped back from daily operations. She hesitated, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "I suppose it makes sense," Rosa murmured, keeping her voice low so the passing servers would not hear. "We just assumed you wanted it this way, since you signed off on the new brand policies." My hands went perfectly still. "Which brand policies?" Rosa looked at me carefully, searching my face. She set the clipboard on the counter and slid it toward me. "The new payroll instructions. Miss Ashford had the accounting department send them over last week, claiming she was streamlining operations for her luxury event launch. She said you and Michael approved the changes." I looked down at the weekly manifest. The column for staff gratuities had been completely zeroed out. Thousands of dollars in mandatory service charges, money that belonged to the people sweating over these stoves, had been redirected. "Rosa," I said, forcing my voice to remain even, "where did the tips go?" "A separate consulting account," the manager replied, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "Miss Ashford told the staff last night that there would be no gratuity for this event, and anyone who discussed it with the guests would be terminated immediately. We figured you agreed, because you let Michael handle the venue contracts now." I had not agreed to anything, and the realization of what my son had allowed to happen in my name felt like a physical blow to the chest. Eleanor and I built Mercer Table Catering on a simple rule. We protected our people, and our people protected the food. Now the son we raised was letting his bride steal wages from the very employees who had watched him grow up. A loud crash echoed from the far corner of the kitchen, followed by a sharp intake of breath. I stood up and walked toward the noise. Elias, a server who had been with us for 12 years, was leaning heavily against a speed rack. A tray of shattered champagne flutes lay at his feet. The 65-year-old man was clutching his lower back, his face pale and shining with sweat. "Leave it, Elias," I instructed, stepping forward to grab a broom. "You need to sit down." "I am fine, Mr. Mercer," Elias gasped, waving me away and trying to bend down. "I just moved wrong. I can finish the shift. Please, I need the hours." "You have a pulled muscle, and you are not serving another table tonight," I told him, putting a hand on his shoulder to stop him from bending over the broken glass. Before I could guide Elias to a chair, the kitchen doors burst open. Camille marched into the room, her heavy silk wedding gown rustling aggressively against the tile floor. She did not look at me. Her furious gaze locked entirely on Rosa. "What is the delay with the second course?" Camille demanded, her voice cutting through the clatter of the kitchen like a razor. She pointed a manicured finger at Elias. "And why is this man still out there? I specifically told you to keep the older staff in the back. They look tired, and it completely ruins the energy of the room. I want young, attractive servers pouring the wine." Rosa stood her ground, though her hands trembled slightly. "Elias is one of our most experienced captains, Miss Ashford. But he is injured, so he will be clocking out." "He is not clocking out until the room is flipped," Camille snapped, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. "Nobody leaves early. If he walks out now, you can consider him fired. We are running a high-end brand here, Rosa, not a charity for tired old men." My daughter-in-law turned around and marched back into the ballroom before anyone could respond. The heavy doors swung shut, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Something dark and heavy settled into my stomach. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the cooks, the servers, and the dishwashers. These people had worked through holidays and weekends, building the reputation that made this company valuable, and my son had handed them over to a woman who treated them like disposable props. I needed to shut this down immediately. Under our standard contracts, I had the authority to pull the staff for workplace abuse, but if I stopped service right now, it would just be an argument about a rude bride. I needed to know exactly how deep this deception went, and I needed the evidence in my hands. "Rosa," I said, keeping my tone deadly quiet, "did Camille leave anything else in the office?" The manager nodded, walking toward the small glass-enclosed booth at the back of the kitchen. "Just the tablet they are using to project her brand launch video during the toasts. She wanted me to make sure it was queued up to the right timestamp." I followed Rosa into the office. She picked up a silver tablet and tapped the screen to wake it up. A paused video frame filled the display, showing a beautifully lit kitchen with copper pots hanging from a wooden rack. My breath caught. It was not a stock image. It was a photograph of the small, cramped apartment kitchen where Eleanor had developed her first recipes 30 years ago. "Press play," I told Rosa. The video started rolling, accompanied by soft, acoustic guitar music. A sleek logo appeared on the screen, spelling out "The Camille Collection." And right beneath it, a stylized caption faded into view, claiming the heritage of a woman who never lived. I stared at the screen, realizing that Camille was not just stealing money from my staff. She was stealing the ghost of the woman I loved. The tablet screen cast a cold light across the small office. Rosa stood quietly by the door, pretending to check a supply list, but her dark eyes kept darting toward the glowing display. On the screen, my daughter-in-law was walking through a rustic kitchen set, running her hand lovingly over a worn wooden cutting board. A soft acoustic melody played from the tiny speakers. Camille was telling a beautiful story about generations of women in her family passing down culinary secrets, speaking smoothly about the sacred bond of Sunday dinners. Next to the tablet sat a stack of glossy promotional brochures printed for the wealthy guests. I picked one up, feeling the heavy, expensive paper slide against my thumb. The front cover matched the video, declaring the Camille Collection as a return to authentic family heritage. I flipped the page, and my eyes scanned the elegant text. There was no mention of Mercer table catering anywhere in the document. There was no mention of the woman who actually bled and burned her hands to build this menu. Eleanor had been entirely erased. A specific photograph caught my attention on page 3. It showed a close-up of a handwritten recipe for rosemary roasted potatoes. The ink was faded, written in a distinctive, looping cursive that leaned heavily to the right. My chest tightened immediately. That was not a replica or a clever digital forgery. That was Eleanor's actual handwriting. 30 years ago, our small apartment kitchen always smelled of toasted flour and melting butter. My wife used to sit at our wobbly formica table long after the restaurant closed, rubbing her tired eyes while scribbling ideas into a leather-bound notebook. She pressed so hard with her pen that the thick pages crinkled. I knew every coffee stain on that cover, and I knew exactly where that book was supposed to be. The original notebook belonged in the company vault, secured in a climate-controlled storage unit 2 miles away. But Camille had a high-resolution scan of it printed right here in her hands. I slid into the desk chair and woke up the office computer. Even though I had stepped back from daily operations 2 years ago, I still retained full ownership and administrator authority over all company systems. My fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, pulling up the digital checkout logs for our physical archives. The database took a long moment to load, the little icon spinning against a white background. When the record finally populated, a cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me. The log showed that the security box containing Eleanor's original recipe notebooks had been checked out. The date stamp read exactly 8 months ago, and the authorized signature belonged to Michael Mercer. He did not just let his new wife borrow a recipe. My son had walked into the secure vault, taken his dead mother's life work, and handed it to a woman who was now using it to build a luxury brand based on a complete lie. I left the office without saying another word to Rosa, pushing through the swinging metal doors and stepping back into the deafening noise of the kitchen. Michael was standing near the wait station, sipping a glass of sparkling water and checking his gold watch. He looked terribly impatient, probably wondering why his elderly father was taking so long to settle into a corner and be quiet. "We need to talk," I said, stopping directly in front of him. My son jumped slightly, splashing a few drops of water onto the tile floor. He glanced around nervously to see if any of the passing servers were watching us. "Dad, come on. The toasts are going to start in 10 minutes. Can you please just go sit down?" 8 months ago, I said, ignoring his request, you went into the company archive and removed your mother's leather notebook. The color drained instantly from his face. Michael set the glass down on a stainless steel counter, his jaw tightening. For a second, he looked exactly like a guilty teenager caught in a lie, but that brief vulnerability quickly hardened into irritation. You were not supposed to be looking through the logs, the groom muttered, crossing his arms defensively. It is not a big deal. Camille needed a brand anchor for her new event planning business, and those old recipes were just sitting in a box gathering dust anyway. She is giving them new life. She is erasing the woman who wrote them, I replied, keeping my voice low but incredibly steady. She printed those menus without Eleanor's name. She built a whole presentation claiming your mother's history as her own, and you helped her do it. Michael let out an exasperated sigh, running a hand through his expensive haircut. You are overreacting. It is just marketing, Dad. Nobody actually cares who invented a chicken dish 30 years ago. Those words hit me harder than a physical punch. Nobody cares. The guests care about the presentation, the story, and the luxury experience, the groom continued, entirely missing the look on my face. Camille's family has the right connections to take this company to the next level, but they need a narrative that fits their social circle. A working-class caterer from a tiny apartment does not fit the brand. He looked me right in the eye when he said it. My 41-year-old son stood there, wearing a custom tuxedo paid for by his mother's sweat, telling me that her real life was not good enough for his new friends. He had willingly supplied the ammunition to erase our family history. So you gave her the notebook, I stated, needing to hear him confirm it completely. Yes, Michael snapped, checking his watch one more time. I gave her the book, and it is going to stay with her brand. You stepped back 2 years ago, so let me handle the business strategy now. Please, just go back to the office and stay out of sight until the dancing starts. He turned around and walked back out into the glittering ballroom, leaving me standing beside a tall stack of dirty silverware. The lingering grief I felt earlier had completely vanished, replaced by an absolute, icy resolve. Michael honestly thought he possessed the authority to trade our legacy away. He was entirely wrong. I walked to the very back of the kitchen, past the steaming dish pit, and keyed my personal code into the secure supply room. The heavy steel door clicked open, revealing rows of dry goods and locked file cabinets. At the very bottom shelf, hidden beneath stacks of old inventory reports, sat a gray plastic storage box that I had brought from my home office. I knelt on the cold concrete floor and unlatched the lid. It was time to show my son who actually owned the company. The heavy manila folder felt rough against my calloused palms, its thick paper edges slightly worn from being shoved into the bottom of a plastic storage box. Inside the quiet supply room, surrounded by towering shelves of dry goods and commercial flour bins, I pulled out the operational records that Rosa archived at the end of every month. Our floor manager never entirely trusted digital cloud servers, always keeping physical backups of the venue contracts and internal memos. Right now, I was deeply grateful for her old-fashioned habits. I flipped open the cover, and a printed email exchange stared back at me. The document featured our company letterhead, followed by a detailed project timeline for the Camille collection. My eyes traced the black text, following a conversation between my son and the lead marketing director. The director had explicitly asked how to credit the original chef for the Sunday chicken and the rosemary potatoes in the promotional materials. Michael's typed reply was only a single sentence long, but it carried the devastating impact of a physical blow. The message read that the marketing team was to remove all references to Eleanor Mercer and completely rebrand the origin story to align with the Ashford family aesthetic. He had typed those exact words. My 41-year-old son deliberately orchestrated the erasure of his own mother to secure his place in a wealthy social circle he was not born into. He did not just let Camille borrow a recipe book, but he had actively managed the corporate strategy to wipe Eleanor from our company history. I closed the folder, feeling a strange, hollow calmness settle beneath my ribs. The sharp sting of betrayal faded, replaced by something much colder and far more dangerous. I left the supply room, walking past the clattering dish pit and stepping out into the narrow service corridor that connected the bustling kitchen to the main ballroom. Michael and Camille stood near the heavy velvet curtains, waiting to be announced for the champagne toasts. The bride was checking her makeup in a small silver compact, while the groom nervously adjusted his custom silk cuffs. They looked like the perfect elite couple, entirely separated from the grease and heat of the kitchen behind them. "Michael!" I called out, my voice echoing slightly against the concrete walls. He turned around, and that familiar flash of annoyance tightened his jaw. "Dad, "What are you doing out here in the hallway? The event coordinator is about to call us inside." I stopped a few feet away from them, keeping the manila folder held loosely at my side. "I am giving you one last chance to fix this. When you walk out onto that stage and give your speech, I want you to tell those people where the food actually came from. Tell them about the woman who wrote those recipes." Camille snapped her compact shut with a sharp, echoing click. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and utter exhaustion, offering the kind of patronizing smile usually reserved for a confused child. "Henry, please stop doing this. We are launching a multi-million-dollar lifestyle brand tonight, and we cannot confuse our new investors with a depressing story about a struggling caterer." "I am talking to my son," I said, my gaze never leaving Michael. "Look me in the eye and tell me you did not plan this." The groom sighed heavily, running a hand over his perfectly styled hair. He glanced around the empty corridor, ensuring no wealthy guests were wandering nearby, before turning back to face me. "Of course I planned it. Mom made great food, but she lacked vision. She was perfectly happy smelling like roasted garlic and wearing cheap aprons. But I am not. I spent my entire life being the caterer's kid at private schools, always parking the delivery van a block away so my friends would not see it. I am done apologizing for where we came from." Those words hung in the warm air, toxic and heavy. My son was not just embarrassed by his father's presence tonight, he had always been ashamed of us. The late nights Eleanor and I worked to pay for his college tuition, the burned hands that packed his lunches, all of it was just a permanent stain on his perfect corporate image. A soft clatter drew my attention toward the swinging kitchen doors. Rosa stood just inside the corridor, holding a tray of polished silver forks. Her dark eyes were wide and shining with unshed tears, her knuckles turning white where she gripped the metal tray. She had heard every single word. Several other servers clustered silently behind her, their faces pale as they stared at the man they had watched grow up. Michael noticed the staff watching him, and his posture immediately stiffened. He did not offer an apology, nor did he show a single ounce of regret. Instead, my son straightened his expensive tuxedo jacket and looked at Rosa with absolute chilling indifference. "Keep the service moving, Rosa," Michael commanded, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "And make sure the kitchen doors stay firmly shut. We do not want the ballroom smelling like grease while the guests are eating." He offered his arm to Camille, and the two of them stepped confidently through the velvet curtains as the crowd erupted into roaring applause. I stood in the quiet corridor, listening to 150 elite guests cheering for a lie. The hollow feeling in my chest finally cracked completely, giving way to an absolute, unyielding resolve. I had spent 2 years letting Michael play the executive, hoping he would eventually learn the value of the people who actually worked for him. But a man who could sell his own mother's memory for a round of applause would never protect his employees. I walked slowly over to Rosa. The veteran manager was wiping her eyes with a white linen napkin, her shoulders trembling with quiet outrage. "He told us she wanted it this way," Rosa whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned against the wall. "Mr. Michael told the staff that Eleanor wanted Camille to take over the recipes. He used her memory to make us work double shifts for this launch, and then he let that woman steal our tips." "I know," I said gently, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, "and I am going to stop it." Rosa looked up at me, a spark of fierce determination cutting through the tears in her eyes. "What do you need me to do?" I handed her the heavy manila folder and took a slow, deep breath, letting the familiar scent of the kitchen ground me. "Go to the main office, Rosa. Open the locked filing cabinet and bring me the master vendor agreement." Rosa's footsteps were heavy against the tile floor as she returned to the small glass-enclosed office. She carried a thick blue binder, its spine worn from years of daily use. The faded gold letters on the cover spelled out Mercer Table Catering Master Agreements. She set it down on the metal desk with a solid thud, a sound that seemed to cut right through the chaotic ambient noise of the kitchen outside. I opened the binder, flipping past the standard venue liability waivers and the floral arrangements until I reached page 14. There it was, the Employee Dignity Clause. Eleanor and I had our attorney draft this exact paragraph 20 years ago, right after an intoxicated groomsman threw a hot serving plate at one of our teenage bussers. The legal language was incredibly simple and completely bulletproof. The clause stated that our company reserved the right to immediately cease all service if any employee faced physical threats, verbal abuse, or financial exploitation. According to the terms of the contract, any food already placed on the tables would remain there, but all unserved company-controlled inventory would be immediately packed and removed from the premises. We would not be stealing their dinner. We simply would not be providing the rest of it. Rosa, I need everything documented right now, I said, sliding the heavy binder toward her. Get the standard incident report forms from the filing cabinet. We are going to do this completely by the book. The veteran manager nodded sharply, pulling a stack of carbon copy sheets from the bottom drawer. First, we needed to address the physical toll on the staff. I walked out to the break area where Elias was sitting on an overturned plastic milk crate, pressing a bag of crushed ice against his lower back. His breathing was terribly shallow, and his face looked pale under the harsh fluorescent ceiling lights. I knelt down next to him, using the top of a prep counter to write out a formal injury report. My pen scratched across the paper as I documented exactly how the older server had been forced to carry overloaded trays, despite reporting a pulled muscle. Elias signed his name on the bottom line with a shaking hand, looking up at me with tired, watery eyes. "Are we going to be in trouble, Mr. Mercer?" the older man asked softly, his voice trembling just a little. "No, Elias," I told him, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into my shirt pocket. "You are going home to rest, and you will be paid for your full shift." Next came the financial theft. I returned to the office, where Rosa had already pulled up the digital payroll records and the gratuity accounting logs on the main computer monitor. She printed the spreadsheets, the machine whirring loudly, and laid the warm papers side by side on the desk. The numbers printed in black ink told a very clear, very damning story. The mandatory 20% service charge, a fee legally meant to be distributed among the hourly workers, had been manually zeroed out. The funds were routed directly into a separate consulting account owned by the bride. Everything was laid out in front of me. I had the injury report, the payroll records, and the gratuity accounting. But the most important piece of evidence was still waiting inside the blue binder. I sat back down in the squeaky leather desk chair and turned to the final signature page of the master vendor agreement. In order to activate the dignity clause, I needed absolute proof that the client had formally acknowledged the terms. Usually, my son handled the final signatures for venue bookings. If Michael had signed this document, legally pursuing the breach of contract would mean dragging my own child into a messy civil lawsuit. My stomach twisted at the thought of it. I ran my index finger down to the bottom of the page, holding my breath as I searched for the authorized name. The signature on the dotted line did not belong to my son. The sprawling, elegant cursive clearly spelled out Camille Ashford, meaning the bride had personally signed the clause. A dark sense of satisfaction washed over me, completely replacing the anxiety. According to the digital date stamp, Michael had generated the contract, but his bride had executed the electronic document herself. She had blindly agreed to our zero-tolerance policy without ever bothering to read the fine print. Camille had legally trapped herself, handing me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her perfect evening. The kitchen doors swung open suddenly, and the faint sound of a microphone feeding back echoed from the main ballroom. The speeches were wrapping up. In exactly 15 minutes, the catering staff was scheduled to begin plating the main course. I stood up from the desk, smoothing out the front of my wrinkled shirt, and walked into the center of the kitchen. The long stainless steel prep tables were lined with hundreds of pristine porcelain plates, ready for Eleanor's famous Sunday chicken. The cooks and servers were moving into their final positions, hurriedly wiping down counter edges and adjusting their black aprons. "Stop what you are doing," I announced, pitching my voice loud enough to be heard clearly over the heavy hum of the ventilation hoods. "Everyone, gather around the plating station." 30 employees stopped moving. They put down their metal tongs and their silver serving trays, exchanging confused glances. Slowly, they formed a quiet circle around me, their faces reflecting a mixture of deep exhaustion and nervous curiosity. Rosa stood at my right side, clutching the signed vendor contract and the payroll records tightly against her chest. I looked at the people who had built my company from the ground up. I saw the pale burn scars on the arms of the line cooks, the tired eyes of the dishwashers, and the aching posture of the older servers. My own son had sold them out for a seat at a wealthy table, and his bride had treated them like disposable garbage. But Henry Mercer still owned this kitchen, and I was not going to let Eleanor's legacy be built on their suffering. "I have reviewed the event contracts and the weekly payroll," I told them, letting the silence stretch out for a heavy, deliberate moment. "And now I need to ask you all one question." The entire room held its collective breath. The only sound was the soft bubbling of a stock pot simmering on the back burner. I looked directly at Rosa, then at the young prep cook, and finally at Elias leaning heavily against the doorway. "Do you feel safe?" I asked. "Do you feel safe?" I asked. The kitchen remained completely still. The young prep cook looked at the floor, and the dishwashers shifted uncomfortably on their rubber mats. Finally, Rosa stepped forward. She looked at Elias, who was still pressing a bag of crushed ice against his lower back, and then she looked directly at me. "No, Mr. Mercer," Rosa answered, her voice echoing clearly over the hum of the ventilation hoods. "We do not feel safe, and we are tired of being treated like we do not matter." I gave her a single, slow nod. The decision was made, and the heavy weight I had been carrying all evening finally lifted from my shoulders. "Turn off the gas," I instructed the executive chef. "Pack the hot boxes. We are shutting down the service." A ripple of shock went through the crew, but nobody argued. The executive chef reached for the heavy steel knobs, and a series of sharp clicks echoed through the room as the massive commercial burners were extinguished one by one. The loud sizzle of the Sunday chicken faded into a soft hiss, replaced by the sound of running water as the line cooks began scrubbing their stations. "Listen to me carefully," I said, raising my hand to keep their attention. "According to the contract, any food that is already in the ballroom belongs to the client. Leave the salads and the bread baskets right where they are. But the entrees, the desserts, and every piece of unserved company inventory is going back to the commissary. Box it all up and wheel the carts out to the loading dock." The kitchen instantly transformed. The frantic energy of a high-end dinner service shifted into the cold, methodical efficiency of a strike. Cooks began transferring the roasted poultry into insulated plastic carriers, while the servers stacked clean porcelain plates back into their wooden shipping crates. Rosa walked through the room, collecting the staff aprons and telling everyone to gather their personal belongings. I stood near the dish pit watching the machinery of my company reverse itself. Nobody panicked, and nobody rushed. They moved with the quiet dignity of people who finally knew someone was looking out for them. But outside the heavy metal doors, the illusion was beginning to crack. Through the small circular window, I could see the dimly lit ballroom. The guests had finished their first course nearly 20 minutes ago. Wealthy socialites and potential investors were sitting in front of empty salad bowls, glancing around the room and waiting for the waitstaff to appear. The string quartet had started playing their third filler song, and a low murmur of confusion was rippling across the tables. The swinging doors suddenly burst open, hitting the wall with a loud, violent crash. Camille marched into the kitchen, gripping the skirts of her custom designer gown. Michael trailed closely behind her, his face flushed and sweating under the collar of his tuxedo. The bride stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open as she took in the scene. The stoves were cold. The prep counters were completely bare. The servers were standing near the back exit, wearing their street coats and holding their car keys. "What is going on in here?" Camille shrieked, all of her practiced elegance vanishing in a single second. She pointed a trembling finger at the insulated carts. "Where is the main course?" "My investors are waiting for the dinner service." I did not raise my voice, nor did I take a step toward her. I simply picked up the thick blue binder from the desk and held it under my arm. "Mercer Table Catering has invoked the Employee Dignity Clause. Your event is officially unserviced." Michael stepped in front of his wife, holding his hands up like he could somehow physically stop the catering vans from leaving. "Dad, you cannot do this. You are ruining the brand launch. We have media people sitting out there." "I am protecting my employees," I replied calmly. "Your wife signed a legally binding vendor agreement that strictly prohibits workplace abuse and wage theft. She broke those terms tonight, so we are packing up our inventory and leaving." Camille let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to slip from its pins, and red splotches of anger colored her neck. "You are insane. You cannot just cancel a wedding dinner because you got your feelings hurt over a seating arrangement. I will sue you for every penny this company is worth. I will completely destroy your reputation." "You are welcome to try," I said, pulling the carbon copy injury report from my shirt pocket and laying it on the steel counter. "I have documented proof that you forced an injured man to carry overloaded trays. I have the digital payroll logs showing you diverted mandatory staff gratuities into your own private consulting account. And most importantly, I have your electronic signature on the contract." My daughter-in-law stared at the piece of paper, the color rapidly draining from her face. She looked at Michael, clearly expecting her husband to fix the situation. But my son was staring at the floor in absolute silence. He knew the legal structure of the company better than anyone, and he knew exactly how airtight that specific clause was. "You have the salads," I told them, turning to walk toward the loading dock. "I suggest you tell your guests to eat slowly." Before I could take another step, the heavy kitchen doors swung open for a third time. It was not a server coming back for a forgotten coat, and it was not the event planner checking on the schedule. A tall man in a dark charcoal suit stepped into the room, holding a half-empty champagne flute. I recognized him immediately from the seating chart. He was the lead partner at the venture capital firm Camille had been courting all year. The wealthy investor looked at the cold stoves, the packed boxes, and the furious bride. "Excuse me," the investor said, his deep voice carrying easily across the quiet kitchen. "I was just wondering why the owner of the brand we are supposed to be funding is standing in the back room while her entire catering staff walks out the back door." The venture capital investor stood in the doorway, swirling the pale champagne in his flute as he waited for an answer. Behind him, the heavy velvet curtains separating the kitchen from the ballroom were pulled slightly apart, revealing a dozen other wealthy guests who had followed the commotion. The low murmur of the crowd had entirely stopped, replaced by a sharp, expectant silence. They were all looking at Camille, waiting to hear how the founder of this new luxury brand would handle a massive operational failure. "Mr. Sterling," Camille stammered, frantically trying to smooth her hair and paste that practiced, apologetic smile back onto her face. She took a step toward the investor, completely ignoring the packed inventory carts behind her. "It is just a minor labor dispute with a third-party vendor. We are handling it, and the dinner service will resume shortly." I stepped out from behind the metal prep table, holding the thick blue binder against my side. "There is no labor dispute, Mr. Sterling. The event is over." The investor raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting from the panicked bride to the calm, 68-year-old man wearing a wrinkled dress shirt. "And you are?" "Henry Mercer," I answered, extending my free hand. "Owner and founder of Mercer Table Catering. We were contracted to service this wedding, but we have just invoked the Employee Dignity Clause to protect our staff from physical and financial abuse." A collective gasp rippled through the guests standing in the hallway. Mr. Sterling did not gasp. The seasoned businessman simply lowered his champagne flute, his expression turning sharp and analytical. He looked at Camille, and the warmth completely vanished from his eyes. "I was under the impression that the Camille collection owned the recipes and the catering infrastructure," the investor said, his voice deadly quiet. "You told my board that the heritage story in your promotional video belonged to your family." "It does," Michael interrupted, stepping forward to shield his wife. My son pointed an angry finger at me, his face red with desperation. "My father is just a retired caterer who cannot handle losing control of the business. The recipes belong to my mother, and I gave them to Camille." "Then you should probably explain why your company email account shows otherwise," I said. I turned back to the small glass office and nodded at Rosa. Our manager had not been standing idle while we argued. Following my earlier instructions, Rosa had accessed the company's main marketing server through the administrative portal. She walked out of the booth carrying the silver presentation tablet, its screen glowing brightly in the dim kitchen. I took the tablet from her and held it up so Mr. Sterling and the gathered guests could clearly see the screen. As the legal owner of Mercer Table Catering, I retain full administrator access to all of our digital assets. What you are looking at is the metadata from the promotional video that Miss Ashford played for you tonight. The screen displayed a detailed log of file transfers, clearly showing the internal corporate history of the brand materials. The video and the printed menus were not created by an independent luxury brand, I explained, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of anger. They were developed using Mercer Table Catering resources, approved by Michael Mercer on his company email, and uploaded to our servers before being passed off as Camille's personal property. My son authorized the theft of our intellectual property to secure your investment. Mr. Sterling leaned in slightly, reading the digital timestamps and the corporate email addresses displayed on the screen. The evidence was irrefutable. The entire foundation of the Camille collection was built on stolen corporate assets. "That is a lie," Camille shrieked, her voice cracking as she lunged toward the tablet. "He is doctoring the files. Michael, tell them he is lying." But my son did not speak. The groom stood completely frozen, staring at the glowing screen. He knew exactly what the company archive contained, and he knew that I could pull up the original photographs of Eleanor's handwritten notebooks with a single tap. "There are also the original archive photographs," I added quietly, swiping the screen to display the high-resolution scans of Eleanor's worn leather notebook. "As you can see, the handwriting matches the menus on your tables perfectly. But the author's name at the top of the page is Eleanor Mercer, not Camille Ashford." The silence in the kitchen was absolutely crushing. The elite guests in the hallway were whispering frantically, pulling out their smartphones to text the other tables. The carefully constructed illusion of the perfect, wealthy bride had shattered completely, leaving only the ugly truth exposed under the harsh, fluorescent lights. Mr. Sterling set his champagne flute down on a nearby metal counter with a sharp, definitive click. He looked at Camille with utter disgust, then turned his attention to Michael. My firm does not invest in stolen assets, and we certainly do not fund founders who steal tips from their own hourly workers, the investor stated, his tone colder than the commercial freezers. The deal is off, Miss Ashford, and I suggest you find a very good lawyer, because my board will be looking into the fraudulent materials you submitted during your pitch. The tall man turned around and walked back through the velvet curtains, followed closely by the other wealthy guests. They were not returning to their tables to eat salad. They were heading for the coat check. Camille let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands as her multi-million-dollar lifestyle brand collapsed into dust. Michael finally moved, taking a slow step toward me. His hands were trembling, and the arrogant sneer was completely gone from his face. "Dad," my son whispered, his voice sounding small and incredibly young. "Please, you made your point. You saved the company. Just put the tablet away." I looked at the boy I had raised. He honestly believed this was just a corporate dispute, a battle over copyright and brand positioning. He still did not understand the true weight of what he had destroyed. "I did not do this to save the company," I told him, reaching into the inside pocket of my wrinkled suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the thick, cream-colored envelope that I had carried with me every single day since the funeral. I pulled the envelope out, letting the bright kitchen lights catch the faded ink on the front. "I did this because of what your mother asked me to do, right before she died." The heavy cream paper felt fragile inside my calloused hands, its edges worn from spending 6 years inside my coat pocket. I ran my thumb over the brittle wax seal, feeling the raised imprint of a tiny whisk that my wife used to press into all of our important family documents. The entire kitchen had gone completely still, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the industrial refrigerators. Rosa stood a few feet away, her dark eyes fixed on the envelope, while the rest of the catering staff gathered quietly behind her to witness everything. I looked at Michael, watching the arrogant posture finally drain out of his 41-year-old shoulders. My son knew exactly what I was holding. He had seen this exact envelope sitting on Eleanor's hospital bedside table during her final week, though he had never bothered to ask what was inside it. "Your mother wrote this a few days before she passed," I told him, keeping my voice incredibly even. "She made me promise to open it only if I ever forgot why we built this company." I broke the wax seal, the dry snap echoing sharply against the stainless steel prep counters. I pulled out the single sheet of lined notebook paper and unfolded it. The familiar, sweeping cursive matched the stolen recipe cards perfectly, but the words carried a weight that no luxury marketing campaign could ever replicate. I cleared my throat and began to read Eleanor's final words out loud, ensuring that every dishwasher and line cook in the room could hear the truth. "My dearest Henry, we spent 30 years standing over hot stoves, missing holidays and birthdays so we could build a name for our son. But as I sit here, I realize that the food we made is not ours, just because our name is printed on the front door. The true heart of Mercer Table Catering belongs to the people who carried the heavy trays, the ones who washed the burnt pans, and the staff who stayed long after midnight to help us clean up." I paused, letting the profound honesty of her statement settle into the cold air. Several of the older servers, the ones who remembered Eleanor working alongside them on the line, wiped quiet tears from their faces. I looked down at the second paragraph and continued reading. "If Michael ever takes over, you must remind him that prestige is an illusion. Do not let him turn our life into a fancy corporate story. Our legacy must honor the workers who bled for us, not the wealthy clients who buy our chicken. Protect the staff, Henry. They are our real family." Eleanor wanted her legacy to honor the workers, rather than serving as a tool for family pride or social climbing. She had seen the quiet shame growing inside our son long before I was willing to admit it, and she had tried to leave a map to guide him back to his roots. I folded the original handwritten letter and slid it safely back into my inside pocket. Michael stared at the floor, his face completely pale and drained of all defiant anger. The groom grabbed the edge of the metal prep table to steady himself, his knees buckling slightly under the crushing weight of his mother's true legacy. For years, he had convinced himself that erasing our working-class background was simply a smart business strategy. But hearing Eleanor's voice reach out from the past completely shattered that delusion. He finally understood that she had known exactly what kind of man he was becoming, and she had explicitly rejected it. My son covered his mouth with a trembling hand and broke down, his chest heaving with silent, devastated sobs. A sudden, sharp gasp drew my attention to the right. Camille was staring at Michael with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The ruined bride did not look at the cold stoves or the packed inventory boxes anymore. She was looking at the man she had just married, realizing the depth of his deception. "You told me she wanted me to have the recipes," Camille whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of betrayal and absolute disbelief. "You brought me her notebook 8 months ago and promised me that your mother wanted to pass her legacy down to a new daughter. You said she always dreamed of taking the brand to a high-end market." Michael could not even look at his wife. He kept his face buried in his hands, weeping openly against the steel counter. The truth clicked into place across Camille's face. She realized she was also deceived by the man she trusted. Michael had not just lied to his father and stolen from the staff. The groom had fabricated an entire emotional narrative to manipulate his wealthy bride, using his dead mother's memory as a cheap bargaining chip to buy his way into the Ashford family circle. Camille had built her fraudulent brand launch and risked her entire reputation based on a foundation of his calculated lies. I watched their new marriage completely fracture before the honeymoon even began. A younger version of myself might have felt a surge of vindictive triumph, but Henry refuses anger in this moment. There was no joy in watching my only child destroy his own life. There was only a deep, hollow sadness and the absolute certainty of what I needed to do next. "Rosa," I called out softly, breaking the heavy silence. Our manager stepped forward, her spine completely straight and her chin held high. "Yes, Mr. Mercer. Have the drivers load the remaining food onto the trucks, and then everyone is going home with full pay for the weekend," I instructed her. I turned back to Michael, watching my son slowly lift his tear-stained face to look at me. He looked exactly like the frightened little boy who used to hide in the back of our delivery van, hoping I would fix whatever mess he had made. But I could not fix this one for him. "I am stepping back in as the active director of this company on Monday morning," I announced, delivering a permanent decision that would change the course of our family forever. "And you are no longer the vice president. You will hand in your corporate keys, Michael, because you are permanently removed from the succession plan." The heavy silver fountain pen felt completely freezing against my knuckles. 3 weeks had passed since the heavy metal doors of the catering kitchen swung shut on the wedding, and the silence inside my attorney's downtown office was thick enough to choke on. A polished mahogany conference table stretched between us, holding a tall stack of legal documents that would officially dismantle the elaborate lie my son had built. I looked across the table at Camille. My daughter-in-law wore a simple, muted gray blouse, her posture incredibly rigid, completely lacking the effortless superiority she had paraded around the ballroom. The collapse of her brand launch had been spectacular, and it had been entirely public when Mr. Sterling pulled his venture capital funding that night. The elite lifestyle magazine slated to feature her launch pulled their cover story the very next morning. The brand launch collapses before a single corporate event was ever booked, leaving her family scrambling to manage the disastrous fallout. My lawyer slid the civil settlement agreement forward, tapping a manicured finger next to the bottom line. The terms were absolute, and they were not up for negotiation. The civil settlement removes all false branding from her portfolio. Camille would immediately cease all commercial use of Eleanor's recipes, publicly retract her claims of ownership, and repay every single dollar of the gratuities she had diverted from my staff. She picked up a cheap plastic pen, her hand trembling slightly as she signed her name, officially surrendering the stolen legacy back to the Mercer family. Michael sat 2 chairs away from his wife, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the polished wood grain of the table. He had not spoken a single word since we walked into the room. My son kept staring at a separate manila folder resting near my right elbow, assuming it contained his standard corporate termination papers. He was only partially correct. "The intellectual property is secure, and the Mercer name is protected," my attorney stated, gathering the signed settlement and placing it safely into a thick, leather briefcase. "Now, we need to finalize the corporate restructuring, Henry." I opened the second folder and pulled out a stack of board resolutions. Michael finally looked up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the heavy linen paper. The former vice president expected to see a standard severance package, but the documents sitting on the table were drafted a long time ago. "I am officially removing you from the executive board, Michael," I said, sliding the corporate resolution across the table. "You are permanently removed from the line of succession, and you will surrender your access to the company servers by the end of the day." "Dad, please," my son pleaded, his voice thick with a desperate, frantic energy. "I know I ruined everything at the wedding, but I can fix it. I will start over at the bottom, working the prep line, or driving the delivery vans if I have to. You cannot just cut me out of the company completely." I shook my head, feeling a profound exhaustion settle deep into my bones. You still do not understand. I am not changing the company structure today to punish you. Henry had already prepared succession documents long before the wedding ever took place. I turned the pages, revealing the complex legal framework for the Mercer Table Employee Trust. Eleanor never wanted you to inherit this business by default, because she knew exactly what money and status meant to you, I explained, watching the color drain completely from his face. I kept you as the vice president for 2 years to see if you would ever learn to respect the people sweating in the kitchens, but you chose to sell them out instead. The succession plan was always going to depend on your character, Michael, and you failed the test. My son stared at the trust documents, finally realizing that his massive inheritance had never been a guarantee. The company was not being taken away from him today. He had slowly forfeited his right to it over the last 2 years, culminating in the ultimate betrayal of his mother's memory. Michael loses succession permanently because he chose to erase the woman who built the foundation of his entire life. I picked up my fountain pen and signed my name on the final page with a smooth, unbroken motion. The ink flowed perfectly, legally establishing that the employee trust transition begins after Henry's retirement. Until that day comes, the company would remain safely under my control. But when I finally stepped away for good, Mercer Table Catering would belong entirely to Rosa, Elias, and the rest of the dedicated staff who actually built it. I did not wait for Camille to offer another empty, practiced apology, and I did not stay to watch Michael process the permanent loss of his corporate empire. I simply gathered my coat, shook my attorney's hand, and walked out into the cool, crisp afternoon air. The bustling city streets felt remarkably quiet as I hailed a yellow cab. I did not give the driver the address for my quiet suburban home, nor did I ask to go to the shiny downtown corporate headquarters. The heavy weight of the last 3 weeks was finally gone, but I had one last place to visit before I could truly close this chapter of our lives. I leaned back against the cracked leather seat of the taxi, watching the tall glass skyscrapers give way to the familiar, worn brick buildings of the industrial district. Henry visits the old kitchen alone, ready to finally bring Eleanor's memory back to where it truly belonged. The yellow cab pulled away from the curb, leaving me standing on the cracked concrete sidewalk of the industrial district. The crisp evening air carried the heavy, unmistakable scent of roasted garlic and browned butter. This was the original commissary kitchen where Eleanor and I had started our catering business 30 years ago. Tonight, the heavy metal loading dock bays were rolled completely open, and bright, warm lights spilled out onto the dark street. We were hosting a community dinner for the neighborhood. I walked through the open bay doors, stepping onto the familiar scuffed floor. There were no crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling here, and absolutely no velvet curtains hiding the cooking stations. Long, folding tables stretched across the center of the large room, surrounded by local families passing heavy ceramic bowls of hot food back and forth. The ambient noise was beautifully deafening. Children laughed, stainless steel silverware clattered against thick plates, and the line cooks shouted incoming orders over the roar of the ventilation hoods. I picked up a simple paper menu resting near the end of the closest table. The text was plain black ink, printed on inexpensive cardstock, completely lacking any gold foil or elegant calligraphy. But right at the very top, printed in bold letters, it read, Eleanor Mercer's Sunday Chicken. Eleanor's name is restored to every signature menu. I ran my thumb over her printed name, and for the first time in 6 years, the tight, suffocating knot in my chest finally loosened. Rosa stood at the main expo station, wiping down the metal counter with a clean linen towel. She wore a simple white apron over her clothes, smiling warmly as she handed a steaming plate to an older gentleman from the neighborhood. I walked up beside our veteran manager and leaned against the cold metal edge of the pass. The dining room looks incredibly good, Rosa, I told her, pitching my voice slightly louder to be heard over the hum of the refrigerators. The food always tastes better when the people cooking it are actually happy, she replied, offering me a wide, genuine smile. I reached into my wool coat pocket. My fingers brushed past the thick manila envelope containing the legal trust documents. I had finalized those binding papers with my attorney just a few hours ago, permanently securing the future of this kitchen. Instead of pulling out the legal paperwork, I withdrew a scratched, stainless steel meat thermometer. It was the very first piece of professional equipment Eleanor and I had ever purchased. I placed the old metal tool gently on the counter and pushed it toward her. Rosa receives Henry's old thermometer. She looked down at the battered glass dial, then slowly looked back up at me, her dark eyes shining brightly under the harsh fluorescent kitchen lights. You are running the floor now, and eventually you will be running the entire operation, I said, making sure my words carried the absolute certainty they deserved. That tool belongs to the head of the family now. Rosa picked up the thermometer, holding it tightly inside her palm. The cooks and dishwashers working on the hotline paused their prep work, turning around to witness the quiet exchange. Tonight, the employees were honored for their decades of loyalty, recognized not just as hired help, but as the true foundation of our entire legacy. I left Rosa to manage the dinner service and walked toward the front office to grab a glass of water. I truly thought the evening was perfectly resolved, and the long corporate battle was finally over. But when I looked out the large front window, I realized the final piece of the story was waiting just outside the glass. A dark sedan sat parked across the street, idling quietly under a flickering street lamp. A man stood leaning against the passenger door, his collar turned up against the cool evening breeze. Michael watches from afar. My 41-year-old son did not wear a custom designer tuxedo tonight, and he did not stand with the arrogant posture of a corporate executive. He just looked incredibly tired, standing alone in the shadows, while the kitchen, his mother built, radiated warmth and laughter completely without him. I knew the harsh reality he was returning to tomorrow morning. Camille loses her luxury brand and her public credibility entirely. The venture capital investors had vanished, the magazine features were abruptly canceled, and her wealthy social circle had quickly distanced themselves from the messy scandal. The fraudulent empire she tried to build had collapsed into dust, leaving her with nothing but legal fees and ruined contracts. And my son had paid the ultimate price for his complicity. Michael permanently loses succession because he betrayed Eleanor's legacy. The corporate keys were gone, his corner office was emptied, and he would have to find a way to rebuild his own life without the Mercer name acting as his permanent financial safety net. Across the dark street, Michael slowly pulled his hands from his pockets and raised his arm, offering a small, hesitant wave. I stood by the window, watching the boy I had raised. The cold determination that had fueled me through the wedding and the endless legal meetings was completely gone, leaving only a quiet, steady peace. I did not turn my back on him, and I did not pull the office blinds shut. I raised my own hand and waved back. Henry leaves the door open for reconciliation, but never restores the inheritance. If my son wanted to call me tomorrow, I would gladly answer the phone. If he wanted to meet for coffee and talk about his life, I would buy his cup and listen. But the company was no longer his birthright. Henry keeps ownership until the planned transition to the employee trust. Mercer Table Catering would remain under my direct protection until the day I retired, and then it would belong entirely to the people who washed the pans and carried the heavy trays. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar smell of roasted poultry and fresh herbs fill my lungs. The loud clatter of silverware and the bright sound of Rosa laughing drifted over from the dining room. I turned away from the dark window and walked back toward the serving line, ready to serve dinner to the people who truly mattered. Henry closes the story. When the final plates are cleared and the kitchen lights finally click off, you are left with a quiet, profound realization about what it actually means to build a legacy. You see, we spend so much of our lives trying to leave something valuable behind for our children. We work the incredibly long hours, we sacrifice our own physical comfort, and we build businesses or homes, hoping to give them an easier path than the one we had to walk. But sometimes, in our desperate rush to give them absolutely everything, we forget to teach them the actual value of the dirt on our hands. The hardest educational lesson you can ever learn as a parent is that you cannot simply hand over your life's work to someone who refuses to respect the sweat it took to create it. True wealth is never found in a luxury brand launch or a perfectly curated social media image. It is found in the quiet loyalty of the honest people who stand by you when the ovens are hot and the work is exhausting. If you are listening to this right now, and you have spent decades building a life from the ground up, you need to hear this message very clearly. Your personal history is not an embarrassing secret to be swept into the back kitchen when the wealthy guests arrive. Your early struggles, your humble beginnings, and the permanent calluses on your hands are the true, unshakable foundation of your family. Do not ever let anyone, not even your own flesh and blood, make you feel like your authentic past is just a messy inconvenience. You have the absolute right to protect the dignity of what you have built over the years. And more importantly, you have the fundamental legal and moral right to decide who actually deserves to inherit the fruits of your labor. It is incredibly painful to realize that the people you raised might not share your moral compass. We often confuse unconditional love with unconditional access. But establishing a firm boundary is not the same thing as abandoning your child. You can leave the front door unlocked for them. You can answer their phone calls, you can buy them a cup of coffee, and you can still love them deeply from across the table. But you do not owe them the keys to your financial empire or your family legacy if they have proven they will use those privileges to step on the people who truly matter. True forgiveness can be given freely, but corporate authority, trust, and privilege must always be earned through consistent character. This story brings up a very difficult conversation about family dynamics, generational loyalty, and the ultimate breaking points we all eventually have to face in our own lives. If you were standing in Henry's worn shoes, watching your own child sell out your precious family history for a momentary taste of high society, what would you have done in that kitchen? Have you ever had to draw a hard, incredibly painful boundary with a close family member to protect your own dignity or the dignity of the people you deeply care about? I would genuinely love to read your stories, so please take a moment to share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments down below. Let us continue to build a supportive community where we always remember that our true worth is never, ever determined by a fancy seating arrangement.